Last month, we did a video covering true crime stories that had wholesome-sounding beginnings, only for them to take incredibly dark turns. I mentioned at the time to let us know if you wanted to hear more of these kinds of stories, and the response seemed to be a pretty overwhelming yes. So today, I've got 2 more stories like this to tell you. I have to say, I think these might be even more twisted than the ones in the first video, so if you thought that was compelling, well, then definitely stick around. I should also say that we came across even more of these cases while doing research for this video, so depending on how this goes, we can probably make this a recurring series if that's something you'd all be interested in. Definitely let us know in the comment section below, but in the meantime, let's dive into today's stories. This first case has one of the most horrifying twists I've come across in a while. It's a love story, but not in the way you might initially think. In late 2001, 42-year-old Gene Thurnow decided it was time for a change. After 20 years of marriage, he and his wife had gotten divorced, and he was desperately in need of a fresh start. Gene's marriage had ended in a pretty devastating way. For a long time, his wife had been suffering from a debilitating and terminal illness. It had taken a lot from them, including their ability to have children. Through everything, Gene had been a devoted husband, but despite this, his wife had turned around and left him for someone else. As you might imagine, Gene was gutted by this. For a while, his heartbreak really consumed him, and he didn't know what to do with himself. One of the few places where he really found comfort, though, was at work. Gene was an air traffic control specialist in Columbus, Nebraska. It was a career he had started after leaving the Air Force, and it allowed him to use the skills he had developed during his military service. He not only enjoyed the job, he was quite good at it, and one of the things that made it even better was that he worked with a really solid group of people. In fact, one of his coworkers ended up being a guy who Gene's father had actually trained many years before. Even so, Gene eventually realized that the job alone couldn't be his whole life. So towards the end of that year, he put in for a transfer to Florida. By this time, most of his family was already living there, including his siblings and parents. So it seemed like a good place to start over. Gene's transfer was approved, and in January of 2002, he started working at the flight service station at the St. Pete Clearwater International Airport. Of course, this was still a difficult decision for Gene. He'd been at his job in Columbus for quite a few years, and he was comfortable there. However, he quickly felt that he'd made the right choice. Being closer to his family made a huge difference, and he especially enjoyed spending time with his nieces and nephews. The transition at work took a little more getting used to, but just a couple of months after starting in Florida, he got some interesting news. A guy from his old job in Nebraska was also transferring to St. Pete Clearwater. His name was Bob Peterson. Now, Bob and Gene weren't super close or anything. In fact, Bob could be a bit of an oddball. He wasn't the most socially aware guy, and as a result, people tended to steer clear of him. You know, he was sort of a loner and didn't have a lot going for him. Still, Gene always tried his best to be kind to everyone, and he and Bob had been friendly in the past. They had bonded over their mutual love of animals, and at one point when Gene's dog had puppies, he let Bob buy one. All this is to say that even though Bob might not have been Gene's first choice in terms of people to come over, he was still happy to see a familiar face. And when Bob got there, it definitely felt like he felt the same way. Just like at their old workplace, Bob didn't have the easiest time fitting in. So even though Gene was still new himself, he kind of took on the role of getting Bob acclimated and feeling at home. Pretty soon, Bob and Gene had fallen into their old dynamic. Again, they weren't hanging out a ton outside of work or anything, but they were on most of the same shifts together, and Gene would make a point to eat with Bob at mealtimes and strike up conversations. The more they talked, the more it actually seemed like they had a lot in common. One of the things Gene loved in addition to dogs was cars, especially pickup trucks. And shortly after Bob moved down to Florida, he ended up getting the same make and model truck as Gene. So there was lots for them to talk about there as well. As you can probably tell from everything I've said so far, Gene was a very likable and charismatic guy. And it didn't take long for other people to notice that as well. Eventually, he caught the eye of one person in particular, a fellow air traffic controller named Juanita Formoso. Like Jean, Juanita was in her mid-40s and had also been in a marriage that had ended in divorce after 20 years. She had 3 children who were all in their teens, but she was finally in a place where she felt like she was ready to date again. Now, Jean and Juanita didn't get into a relationship right away. Instead, they got to know each other at work and slowly developed feelings for one another. They finally started dating in 2004, when one day Juanita got up the courage to ask Jean out to a 24-hour breakfast place near the airport. He said yes, and from there, things moved pretty quickly. Within a year, Jean proposed, and he and Juanita got engaged. Of course, office romances can be a tricky thing to navigate, so for the longest time, Jean and Juanita kept things a secret from their other coworkers. The one exception was Bob, who figured out on his own pretty quickly that they were seeing each other. The 3 of them did a lot of overnight shifts together, so they spent a good chunk of time in each other's company. At first, like a lot of the other people at work, Juanita didn't really know how she felt about Bob. You know, he was definitely an acquired taste, but eventually she started to understand and even appreciate some of his quirks. She also thought it was endearing the way that Jean tried to include Bob in things, especially because not a lot of other people seemed to show any interest in him. And it was clear that this meant a great deal to Bob, even if he didn't always show it in the most conventional ways. For example, after Jean and Juanita got married, they began working on moving in together, which meant consolidating their 2 houses. They were actually having a brand new place built for them in the community of Lutz, and it was Jean's dream home, but it was a huge amount of work figuring out what they were going to do with their current houses and all of their extra stuff. One day, Bob came over and told Jean, "You know what? I really like this property." He put in a generous offer, not just for the house, but for all of the extra furnishings, and said, "Just give me the place as it is, and I'll figure out what to do with anything I don't want afterwards." Jean and Juanita were like, "Great, thank you," and not long after, they went through with the sale. In late summer of 2006, Jean and Juanita moved into their new home, and it was everything they had hoped it would be. The place was beautiful, Jean was getting along well with Juanita's children, and it was just generally a very happy time. It was also going to be the start of a new chapter in more ways than one. So, Jean had always wanted children of his own, but for reasons I already explained, this didn't happen in his first marriage. Juanita knew this, and after some thinking about it, said, "I know I'm older, but I want to have a child with you if it's possible." They explored their options, and eventually they had found an egg donor. It wasn't a guarantee they would be able to conceive, but Jean was still over the moon. Their first appointment to begin their whole baby journey was set for November 8th, and Jean and Juanita excitedly marked it on their calendar. Unfortunately, something would happen before this, though, that would permanently end those plans. Exactly a week before the scheduled appointment, so November 1st, 2006, Jean and Juanita had another event planned. For a while, Bob had been telling them that he had the perfect housewarming gift for them. He kept saying he was really excited to show it to them, but he didn't want to give it to them at work. Of course, this was a bit strange, but, Bob was a strange guy, and by this point, Jean and Juanita were used to it. So eventually, they just invited him over for dinner. They figured he probably just wanted to spend a little time with them and didn't know how to ask, and they were also a bit curious to finally see this perfect housewarming gift. At around 5:30 p.m. that evening, Bob came over, and he, Jean, and Juanita shared some pizza together. When they finished, Bob reached into a bag he brought with him and pulled out a large book, which he handed to them. The book was this beautifully leather-bound photo album, and inside were a whole bunch of pictures of Jean and Juanita's new house. The photos had been taken at various stages of construction as a sort of keepsake so that they could remember their dream house being built. Now, again, this was a bit weird. Bob hadn't told them he was doing this, but it was obvious he had put a lot of work into it. When he gave it to Jean and Juanita, he also thanked them for their years of friendship. So even though it was a bit unusual, it seemed like a thoughtful gesture. The evening continued this way until about 7:30, when Juanita had to run an errand with her daughter. The pair had to pick up a vehicle and also planned to do a little shopping, so she apologized and said she needed to go. Juanita was a bit surprised when Bob didn't also get up to leave as she headed out, But him and Jean were still talking, so she decided it wasn't that big of a deal. Her and her daughter left the house, and when they returned about an hour later, Bob's car was gone. At first, Juanita was relieved because it had been a long day and she was more than ready to wind down. But as she got out of her car and started heading towards the front door, she spotted something strange. It was difficult to make out in the dark, but it looked like there were long red streaks leading down the driveway. As Juanita walked into the house, these streaks continued inside. She called out for Jean, but there was no response. It wasn't until she flipped on the lights in the kitchen that she realized what she had been following was a massive blood trail. Juanita tried to convince herself that there was a reasonable explanation for all of this. She thought maybe there had been some kind of accident and Jean or Bob had to be rushed to the hospital, but when she called Jean's cell phone, she could hear it vibrating. She followed the sounds into the living room where she not only found the phone, but the clothes Jean had been wearing when she left. His t-shirt, his jeans, his shoes, his underwear. It was all there lying on the floor, but there was no sign of Jean anywhere. At this point, Juanita was absolutely terrified and beyond confused, and she immediately called 911. However, it was about to get much worse. You see, there was one final discovery waiting for her in the living room, something that would explain far more than just what had taken place that night. The thing was a typed letter which was sitting on an end table in the living room. The letter was addressed to Jean and had been written by Bob, and it explained that Bob had been obsessed with Jean for years. The letter read in part, quote, "Dear Jean, I have never been in love with another man until I met you. Do you believe in love at first sight, Jean? I do. It happened when I saw you in Columbus 8 years ago. I've been in love with you ever since. I feel like I've been living a lie all these years, and I just can't do it anymore. You need to know the truth." While the letter may have started out as a declaration of love, things took on a darker and more threatening tone towards the end. That's when Bob revealed he hadn't simply come there that night to come clean about his feelings. He wanted more, and he wasn't going to take no for an answer. The letter continued, quote, "I envy Juanita. She can see and touch your naked body every day. I love you with all my heart and soul. So, Jean, I won't leave here until I taste your manhood." When police arrived, they quickly launched a search, but they couldn't find Jean or Bob anywhere. One of the first places they looked was Bob's home, the same one he had purchased from Jean, but there was no indication that he had been there that night. It wasn't until 2 days later, on November 3rd, that authorities learned that Bob had actually been renting a different home, much closer to Jean and Juanita's new place. Neither of them had any idea about this, but as soon as police got there, it was clear that they were on the right track. Outside on the driveway of the rental property, officers found nearly identical blood marks to the ones that Juanita had discovered when she got home. Just like she had, the officers followed the trail inside. It led them to a master bedroom where they discovered both Bob and Jean's bodies. Bob was lying on the bed in the room with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his head. Jean had been shot twice in the head with the same weapon and was lying unclothed on the floor. Horrifically, his genitals had also been removed with a razor blade. While we can never know exactly what took place on the night of November 1st, 2006, based on the available evidence at both crime scenes, it seems almost certain that Bob went to Jean and Juanita's house intending to commit a chilling act of violence. We know that he took the gun he used to kill Jean with him to their home because one of the spent shell casings from the weapon he used was found near Jean's clothing. The real gift Bob thought he was giving Jean was never the photo album. It was the letter and what it represented, his twisted version of love. And when he realized that those feelings would never be returned, he decided to kill Jean instead. Following the nightmarish discovery, all sorts of things clicked into place for Juanita about Bob. Red flags that she and Jean had either missed or failed to fully appreciate because they were trying to be friendly towards him. It started from the very beginning with Bob's transfer to Florida. This hadn't been any kind of coincidence. Bob had specifically followed Jean when he left Nebraska. When Jean and Juanita started their relationship, Bob hadn't figured it out because he knew them well. He had already been watching them by this point. The level of surveillance became even more obvious when Juanita later took a closer look at some of the pictures Bob had included in the photo album he gave them. Some of the images had been taken through their windows, and there was furniture inside, meaning they had moved in by this point. As for Bob purchasing Jean's house, that wasn't any kind of favor either. He was doing anything he could think of to insert himself into Jean's life, and had specifically wanted the things inside. At one point, Bob had even asked for Jean's used linens to be included in the sale. Obviously, Jean ignored this and took his linens with him, but apparently Bob was pretty upset about it. This brings me to the final point here, and that's the true nature of Bob's feelings for Jean. Though in his letter he claimed he was in love, a few sources we came across brought up a good point, namely that this whole thing feels more akin to a warped form of worship. Bob may not actually have wanted to be with Jean. Perhaps he wanted to be Jean. Obviously, we can never know exactly what was going on in his head, though, so take that with a grain of salt. Just something to think about. Understandably, Jean's loved ones were absolutely devastated by everything that happened. It was especially hard on Juanita, not just because she lost her husband, but because she actually knew Bob and spent time with him and never saw anything like this coming. In an interview we came across, Juanita explained that one of the things she finds comfort in is knowing that unlike Bob, Jean did get to experience true love. And though the time they had together was far too short, she says she knows Jean died at a time when he had pretty much everything he ever wanted in life. Late fall of 2023 was shaping up to be the end of an era for 74-year-old Annette Smith. After many years, she was getting ready to sell her home in Fairfield Park, a tiny village in the English county of Bedfordshire. Now, Annette didn't actually want to put her house on the market. She was only doing it to help out her ex-husband, Peter. They had been separated since 2005, but they remained mostly on good terms. Peter's business had suffered during the pandemic, and he needed the cash from the 20% stake in the property that he owned in order to stay afloat. Understandably, this was going to be a hard change for Annette, but she was reassured by the fact that one thing would be remaining consistent. Wherever she ended up, her close friend and roommate, Scott Patterson, was going to be coming with her. Annette and Scott had met about 15 years earlier when Scott was working at a local bar and restaurant. Despite the 30-year age difference between them, the two of them discovered that they had a lot in common and quickly struck up a friendship. As you may have already gathered, considering how big of a life change she was willing to make to help out her ex-husband, Annette was a very kind person. So when she found out a couple of years into her friendship with Scott that his relationship had ended and he didn't really have anywhere to go, she told him he could come and stay in her spare bedroom. He accepted and moved in not long after. The situation was only supposed to be temporary, but after a few months, Annette and Scott both felt that things were going really well. Annette was enjoying having the company, and Scott was grateful for how much she was helping him through such a difficult time. Annette didn't ask for or want any rent money, but Scott tried to show his appreciation in other ways. He would run errands and do other little things for Annette around the house. Pretty soon, months had turned into years, and whether consciously or not, the living arrangement became a permanent one, even after Scott was back on his feet and had started a new job as a butcher at a local farmer's market. As Annette and Scott got closer, their lives also became more and more intertwined. They hosted regular dinner parties together at the house with other friends, and they even went on holidays together. Scott also met and got to know Annette's family, including her adult stepson, Jason, who she had raised from the age of 5. Things had continued this way for about 6 years until 2018, when Annette suffered a stroke. The stroke was relatively minor, but still, it complicated her life significantly. She was left with permanent weakness in her right hand, and her mobility overall was greatly reduced. Things got even more challenging when the pandemic happened, and she was essentially confined to her home. Now, obviously, this was heartbreaking for Annette, but she and her family were comforted by the fact that Scott was around. He really stepped up and essentially became her live-in caretaker. He bought groceries, picked up all of Annette's prescriptions, and helped her with anything she could no longer do on her own. In that way, it was kind of like things had come full circle. Annette had shown Scott all of this kindness in his time of need, and now he was there to return the favor. So, returning to the late fall of 2023, Annette was getting ready to put her home on the market. Her ex-husband Peter was handling a lot of the logistics, but as you might imagine, there was still a lot of things to do on her end. Because of her poor health, the whole thing was pretty stressful on Annette. As a result, Scott began helping more and more with the preparations. Packing certain things up, making sure the home looked nice, and dealing with the photographer from the real estate agency when they came to take photos for the listing in mid-November. Around this same time, Annette's family and friends noticed that they were hearing from her less and less. But again, they knew that she was having a tough time. She had started suffering from depression after her stroke, and it had been an ongoing battle ever since. Because of this, they were all slightly reassured when in the run-up to the holidays, it seemed like Annette was feeling a little more like herself again. She sent out a bunch of emails and personalized Christmas cards, as well as some gifts for her stepson Jason's children. However, this feeling of relief would not last long. In early January of 2024, the Bedfordshire police were contacted by Peter, who said that he wanted to report Annette missing. He stated that neither he nor anyone else had been able to speak with Annette in person since before the holidays. That wasn't all, though. He said he had reason to believe that she might have been kidnapped. Peter explained that even Annette's roommate, Scott, had no idea where she was. A few weeks before Christmas, she told him that she was going on a trip with one of her friends. Scott asked Annette who this friend was and where they were going, but she acted very cryptic about everything and wouldn't tell him. All Scott knew was that this supposed friend was a woman. The last time he'd seen Annette, she was getting into a blue or black station wagon. She took a suitcase with her, and since then, she hadn't returned. Despite this alarming report, when police first looked into the situation, they said that they couldn't determine whether Annette was actually missing. They wouldn't launch a full investigation until about 3 months later, when Peter contacted them with additional unsettling information. By this point, Peter had been forced to put the sale of Annette's home on hold, as her original anticipated moving day had come and gone without any additional word from her. Scott had since moved out, though, so Peter had eventually gone into the house to look around. When he did, he found Annette's cell phone, her passport, and tons of other personal items. Things that should have been gone if Annette was really on vacation or something. On April 15th, Bedfordshire police put out an alert for Annette on social media, informing the public that she was missing and appealing for any information. It wouldn't take long for them to turn their attention back towards the people in Annette's life, though. Specifically, one person in particular, Scott Patterson. Scott sat down with investigators just over 2 weeks after that social media alert was put down. When he was questioned, he quickly admitted to something very different than the story he had told Peter and the rest of Annette's loved ones.
Are you responsible for the death of Annette Smith?
Yes.
Okay. Right. Tell me what's happened.
I suffocated her in her bed with a pillow.
Okay. When was this?
The 8th of November.
Yeah, you heard that right. The 8th of November. In other words, Annette had been dead for months, including during that entire lead up to Christmas. She had never sent those emails, those cards, or those gifts for her stepson's children. Scott had done all of it. He had been using Annette's computer to make it look like she was still alive. Scott proceeded to confess that he had committed the murder because he had grown tired of being Annette's caretaker. He had grown increasingly overwhelmed and resentful towards her until he said that night he simply snapped.
Tell me in as much detail as you can what happened that day. So start wherever you need to start, but I need as much detail as you can give me. Take your time.
Well, it happened at in the evening, at night, after Annette had fallen asleep. And yeah, I put a pillow over her face until she stopped breathing, and I left her in bed for the night.
What was going through your mind that day?
I just wanted to get out of the situation. And as I say, in hindsight, there are obviously better ways to have done that, but it just felt, I don't know, just felt, when I sort of snapped, I suppose, it just felt like what I should do.
And at what point did you decide to do that? You said it's been a build-up.
Yeah, I think I had thought about it for a little while beforehand.
Mm-hmm. When you say a little while, what does that mean to you?
Maybe a few weeks.
Okay.
Is that what you had been thinking for a few weeks?
Yeah.
Or were you thinking of other ways as well?
No, that was what I was thinking.
When you were suffocating her, did you at any point think to stop?
I did for a split second, because I realised what I was doing was wrong. But then I kind of thought, I wasn't sure. I don't know, I just decided to carry on.
Why did you go to those lengths to do that?
To dispose of the body?
Yeah.
Because I thought if there wasn't a body, I'd get away with it.
If you're wondering what that bit at the end there was about, where Scott mentioned disposing of the body, well, unfortunately, this is where things got even worse.
Where is Annette?
There isn't a full body.
Okay.
And she's in a storage unit. What remains of her is in a storage unit in Letchworth.
Scott explained that after killing Annette, he had spent a considerable amount of time trying to figure out what to do next. At first, he rolled up her body in a large blanket and kept moving it around the house so that it would stay out of sight. Disturbingly, other people had even been in the place after the murder. That was the case with the real estate photographer I told you about earlier. When they came to take the photos to list Annette's house, her body was hidden in a cupboard under the stairs. Scott realized this was unsustainable, so he eventually came up with what he thought was a permanent solution. He told Annette's family that story about her going off on a mysterious vacation and began sending them emails and Christmas cards to make them believe that she was still alive. Meanwhile, over a period of weeks, he used his skills as a butcher to cut Annette's remains into numerous pieces. He then disposed of the body parts in several places, one of those being that storage unit he mentioned. Following the confession, investigators were able to recover Annette's partial remains at the storage facility, along with surveillance footage showing Scott making several trips there after the murder. Despite Scott's claims that the murder had to do with him being overwhelmed by the responsibility of taking care of Annette, authorities soon found evidence that pointed to additional motives. At the time of the killing, he had racked up more than 30,000 British pounds in credit card debt, even though he was living rent-free. On top of this, he had stolen and sold more than 5,000 pounds worth of jewelry and other valuables from Annette. He had started doing this even before the murder. As I'm sure you can imagine, Annette's loved ones were completely horrified and crushed when they learned what Scott had done. They had truly believed that he was a nice guy and cared for her as much as they did. Instead, he had taken all of the kindness she had shown him and repaid it by betraying her in the most awful way imaginable, at a time when she was extremely vulnerable and needed him the most. Scott arguably did make one decent decision. After confessing to everything, he spared Annette's family and friends the additional heartbreak of a public trial and pleaded guilty to her murder. In November of 2024, he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 20 years. He will be eligible for parole at the age of 65.
Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much, everyone, and take care.